Okay, so hi folks, welcome to our first Who's Who class. Just to kind of, I keep getting asked the question of what the Who's Who class is about, so let me just give one last kind of pitch for what it is that we're actually going to be doing here. Oh, here comes Gloria, just a second. Hey, Gloria. Good. Hi, Gloria. You with us?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I just want to give a quick just sort of pitch about what this class is going to be about before we kind of move into it. So the original conception behind this class was the observation that we, in discussions in synagogue, like during Torah discussions or whatever, frequently end up referencing this rabbi or this figure or that figure from Jewish history. And maybe have a chance to maybe sort of give a brief word of explanation and then have to move on because it's not the focus of the thing. And there's maybe the the awareness that not everybody has a thorough grounding in Jewish history, and so there's maybe some lingering questions about who are these various individuals who we keep referencing, especially the ones that we keep referencing over and over and over again. So the conception of this class is it's going to be a sort of historical survey of various rabbinic figures throughout the history of rabbinic Judaism, as a way of getting a taste not only of the history of Jewish ideas, but also a little bit of the history of rabbinic Judaism, right? Because the development of Jewish thought is bound up in the development of the Jewish people in our history and what's happened to the Jews throughout history. So that's really the sort of conception of this class as such, is that we're going to be looking, each one of the classes, we're going to be looking at a particular rabbi or key figure in the history of Jewish thought, and we're going to be examining that individual both in terms of what their lives were about, what was going on in their lives, and also in terms of what was their thought, why are they important in the history of Jewish thinking. Today, though, our first class, I think, is going to be a little bit different from that model, because I thought it might make sense to start out at the beginning with sort of a quick overview of the sort of history of Rabbinic Judaism, with a real focus on the sort of periods of Rabbinic Jewish history. And that's because I'm going to be throwing out a lot of terms here like Tanaim and Amoraim and words like that that are going to make it's going to help, I think, understand who these different people are, and if we understand where they're situated in the broad kind of sweep of the development of Rabbinic Judaism since its inception. And so what I want to do today is kind of zoom way out in our Who's Who and talk not about who's who in the sense of individual rabbis, but talk about who's who in the sense of the sort of eras or generations, the historical periods of rabbis. Just so people are on the same page when it comes to like what historical period we're talking about and the significance of those historical periods, why we divide the history of Rabbinic Judaism up in these particular ways. So obviously everyone should feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go. I'll be trying to make, pause periodically to, make room for that, but don't hesitate to unmute yourself and, jump in and interrupt me if you've got a question, or if I'm not expressing something clearly, or, if you want me to go into something in more detail. This is going to be sort of necessarily a broad sort of sweep as opposed to a super deep dive. But I think by the end of it, everybody ought to have a better sense of being on the same page when it comes to what the general sort of periods are in the development of Rabbinic Judaism and why we use these terms to talk about these different historical periods. Everybody more or less okay with that as a sort of framework for our first class here? Yeah, great. I think this will be really useful. Cool, great. Okay, so for the purposes of, I'm going to be sharing a graphic with you, which I think will come in handy. I think I'm going to do it in two ways. First, I'm going to share this graphic. This is as a PNG graphic that I'm sending through the group chat. So if you want, you can click on that and download it, or bring it up, and you can reference it that way. I'm also going to share the screen here, at least at the very beginning, so people can see what I'm talking about. So what I've got here is kind of a timeline. This is the sort of timeline of Judaism from or at least the timeline of Rabbinic Judaism, from the very beginning of something that we could call Rabbinic Judaism up until the present day, more or less. And what you'll see is that timeline extends from sometime maybe, 200, 250 before the Common Era, up to the Common Era, and then from that time all the way up to the present day. And there's a number of different periods that we've kind of divided up the timeline into. And so the periods, broadly speaking, when it comes to Rabbinic Judaism, there's the time of the Zugot, there's the time of the Tanaim, there's the time of the Amoraim, there's the time of the Savoraim, and there's the Geonim, the Rishonim, and the Acharonim. And all of these terms refer to the grouping of rabbinic sages who were alive and teaching at that time. So we divide up the history of Rabbinic Judaism according to the sort of broad groupings of the rabbis who were alive at that time. So during the Zugot period, the rabbis who were alive and teaching at that time, traditionally in Judaism, we refer to as the Zugot, and the Tanaim, the Tanaitic period, those are the Tanaim living and teaching, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The period is associated with the rabbis, and the rabbis are associated with the period.
The years, because we can't see.
Yeah, I'll be getting into this presently. I want to go through it piece by piece. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. But like I said, I sent the message that the image that I'm using in the chat, so people can download that and look at that independently as they're going through, and that might serve as a useful visual aid. B, we can probably print out a copy and get it to you at some point if you think it would be useful for you moving forward in the class. There's probably ways we can get you a copy of the printed PDF.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we've got Jewish history, or at least rabbinic history, divided up into these periods. And I want to just talk about each period in turn and when approximately we're talking about there and why that period is significant. Okay, so the first of those periods that we're talking about is the period of the Zugot. This is a period that extends, it's roughly coterminous with the Second Temple, right? So in the broadest sense, it begins with the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which is approximately 515 BCE, 515 years before the year 0, that according to the calendar that we typically use, up until the year 70 of the Common Era. So it's a pretty long period of time. The word zug, zugot is a plural of that. Zug means pair. And the reason why the rabbis of this period are referred to as the Zugot is that according to tradition, there are two leading teachers, two main teachers in each generation during this period. And at least according to rabbinic tradition, there's a relationship, a defined relationship between the Zugot, such that one of those individuals is going to be the Nasi, the president of the Sanhedrin, of the high rabbinic court. And the other is going to be the Av Beit Din, literally father of the court. Essentially, that's the vice president of the Sanhedrin. What's significant about this period is this is before, if we want to be really strict about it, this is before the actual rabbinic period. The individuals in question were not necessarily calling themselves rabbi. And the fundamental ideas of rabbinic Judaism had not been nailed down in any kind of, in quite as coherent and clear a format. The thing about the Zugot, and the various rabbinic figures from that time period of pre-destruction Second Temple Judaism, is that these are figures whom the rabbis look back to as their intellectual ancestors, and who are the originators of some of the ideas that get carried forward and become foundational to rabbinic Judaism. Every religious movement has its sort of its intellectual ancestors, the sort of thought world from which it derives its fundamental ideas. And for the rabbis, those were the pre-rabbinic sages, whom they look back to as being essentially part of the same community, right? And who are the originators of a certain way of looking at the Torah and looking at being Jewish, that informs what we eventually come to call rabbinic Judaism. There's a couple of key components of that are going to be important. So what is it that defines rabbinic Judaism? The primary thing is this, that the rabbis recognize the existence of two Torahs. There is the written Torah, i.e. the document of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which supposedly are what were handed down at Sinai and recorded on the scroll that we read from in the synagogue, right? That's the written Torah, the thing that we usually refer to as the Torah. But in addition to that, there is also the oral Torah. The oral Torah is made up of a body of teachings which are not explicitly written down in the scroll, but which are supposedly transmitted by Moses orally to his students, including Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua, his successor, but also to the elders and the other people who learned Torah from him, right? And that these individuals transmitted the Torah to their disciples, and they to their disciples, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line, up until the Second Temple period, which is when rabbinic history, as such, really starts. So the belief of the rabbis, at least, is that in addition to the written Torah, there is also this oral tradition, which is as old as the written Torah, and has been passed down from teacher to student for all of that time, and that they, the rabbis, are the inheritor of that oral tradition. And the important thing about that oral tradition is that it is essential for understanding the written Torah. The written Torah has all kinds of gaps, inconsistencies, and ambiguities that are difficult that make it difficult to understand and put it to practice without an interpretive tradition. And the oral Torah is that interpretive tradition. And it is so important to the rabbis that they consider it to be more or less on the same level as the written Torah. Written Torah and oral Torah are both equally important. That belief in the existence of an oral Torah and the authoritativeness of the oral tradition is not shared by other groups of Jews in the Second Temple period. There are many other groups of Jews that existed in the Second Temple period, many of whom did not eventually go on to become part of the rabbinic kind of culture. For many of those groups, there was no oral Torah. There was no oral tradition. They're relying purely on written Torah, and they've got other approaches to interpreting how the written Torah is supposed to be put into practice. But for the rabbis and their intellectual ancestors, like the rabbis of the Zugot, right, they look back to those Pharisaic ancestors and rely upon them as guarantors of an oral tradition which is supposed to be passed down from teacher to student. I say oral tradition because, at least originally, it was considered wrong to write it down in any way, shape, or form. It was given orally by Moses to his students, and it was actually forbidden to write it down. It needed to be passed down orally and memorized by each generation. And so the period of the Zugot, right, we start to see the development of this idea of rabbinic Judaism, right? Of this idea that there's a written Torah and an oral Torah, and the oral tradition of interpretation is equally important as the written Torah, and it's something that needs to be passed down orally. At this time, most rabbinic, to the extent that we can say that there is a rabbinic culture exists pretty much entirely within Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about a cultural and religious movement that is pretty much limited to that geographical space. This will cease to be the case later on in Jewish history. I've gone on a little bit long about this, but I wanted to really kind of hammer in this idea of oral Torah. I wanted to ask if anyone's got any questions so far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question, because that was actually going to be my question about when you kept saying oral Torah. Was it really oral, or is it just used like, just as like metaphorically as a distinction between the Torah, which is written down, and something else that the rabbis were talking about amongst themselves, but did write it down? So you cleared that up, that basically that it was supposed to be just an oral tradition, and it was passed down from rabbis to their students, and the students then would pass it down to other students. And I guess what my question is going to be, that it really wasn't for the community then. That the Jewish community outside of these scholars was left out in this oral tradition. That's kind of what it sounds like to me.
It wasn't really, no, it was a community, but it wasn't the community. It wasn't the only community. The group of Jews in the Second Temple period who recognized the existence of the oral Torah and consider it to be authoritative are known at the time as the Perushim. Oftentimes better known in the anglicized form as Pharisees.
Okay, but that's a little bit, I don't want to say after the
Zugot.
No, we're talking about the same thing here, basically.
The Zegotes, so the Zegotes, and then the Pharisees, because I associate the Pharisees to around the time when the right before the Second Temple was destroyed. So much later than you gave a period of about 200 and something like that, 250 BCE.
Yeah, we're talking about it. We're talking about something, a culture or a worldview that develops over time, right? So, at any rate, it's difficult to draw clear boundaries historically at this particular point in history because of the way that most of what we know about the Pharisees, we know from basically two sources, right? We know what the rabbis think about the Pharisees, and we know what the Christians think about the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. Both of those consist of people living later on, looking backward into history and putting their own historical slant on these people, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit difficult to kind of like slice things too fine. But certainly the set of ideas, right, according to rabbinic tradition at least, the set of ideas which we associate with the Perushim and which begin to sort of formulate themselves in terms that can be, sort of appropriated and made use of by the later rabbis. The rabbis have a sort of historical record of these pairs of zugot that extends back to around 250 before the Common Era. And at least according to the rabbinic memory, right, these people are operating within the framework of their existing in oral Torah, which would put them more or less in the same kind, at least in the same kind of intellectual worldview as the Perushim. The actual boundaries between one group and another, one community and another, the terminology that people were using for themselves at the time may have shifted somewhat over the period of time we're looking at, right? This is a period of maybe like, a little bit more than 300 years. But in broad terms, if we're at least going to take the rabbis somewhat seriously in their historical memory, this idea of the oral Torah that needs to be translated, that needs to be transmitted by learning it from your teacher, memorizing it, and then teaching it to your students, goes back for quite some time into the Second Temple period.
Did it eventually get written down though?
Yeah, we'll actually get to that in a minute.
Okay.
All right. So during the period of the Zugot, right, there are a number of institutions which exist, right? Most particularly important to the rabbis is that of the Sanhedrin, which is the sort of grand high court of the Jewish people during the Second Temple period. The Sanhedrin doesn't last forever, right? But during the period when it does exist, it represents a body of legal knowledge and also a system of transmitting that legal knowledge down, right? When you've got a system of judges, you need, some way of preserving case law and passing down the sort of legal pronouncements that get made, right? So the sort of, at least according to rabbinic tradition, the sort of tradition of the oral law is heavily associated with the Sanhedrin during the Second Temple period. The extent to which that actually was the case is a little bit difficult to track down because we're talking about a period for which we don't have a lot of objective historical evidence. There are documents from the period, but the extent to which those documents support or do not support the rabbinic conception of history is, I think probably a little bit fuzzy. At any rate, I'm sorry, what was that?
I just have a question. If it was passed down, how do they know that it was so accurate? I mean, I know you're supposed to memorize it, but it's like, to me, it sounds like telephone, that game sort of thing. How do I know that it's the same?
Yeah, I mean, as with a lot of things when we're talking about religion, right, there's a large element to the idea of the oral Torah that pretty much has to be taken on faith, right, and is essentially faith-based, right? In the same way that you either believe or do not believe that the text document that we call the written Torah was literally handed down, like spoken by God and written down verbatim by Moses and is preserved in exactly the same form for, many hundreds of years and thousands of years down to the present day, or whether you don't believe that story and think that the origins of the text were something else, right? Ultimately it comes down to a matter of faith and, whatever access to, historical documentation that you may happen to have. The same thing is the case with the oral Torah. The rabbis maintain a tradition that the oral Torah originates with Moses and is passed down from teacher to student since that day. Okay. But the rabbis don't reference any originators of pieces of oral Torah prior to the Zugot. The Zugot are the earliest named originators of pieces of oral Torah that we get. What we also see is that the oral Torah changes over time. It is certainly the case that new pieces of Torah, new ideas keep getting added to the body of rabbinic wisdom. There's a story about that, right, where Moses is receiving the Torah at Sinai and God takes him forward in time and sits him down in Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva. And and Moses doesn't understand a word of what anybody is saying. And he gets really upset until one of the students raises his hand and asks Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi, where did you learn this piece of wisdom? And Rabbi Akiva says it comes from Moses at Sinai. And Moses is satisfied with that, right? There's a sort of, down there, it's a kind of paradox of the story, right? If Moses doesn't understand it, how can it come from Moses? And so therefore, how can he be satisfied by that statement? I mean, what I think the story is actually meant to communicate is even as the tradition changes over time, there's still, one can still look at that oral tradition as something which originates from Moses at Sinai. And so really, I think that's actually part of the power of the oral tradition, right? Is that in fact, it does change over time, while at the same time adhering very closely to this idea of transmission, right? It can be the case that it changes over time while at the same time maintaining a really strong attachment to the line of transmission. It's just, it's the extent to which it actually does originate from Moses at Sinai is one of those faith-based things, right? That like, if you want to believe in it, then it's something one can believe in. But if not, one can look at it as this is part of the story that Jews tell ourselves about the underpin. It's a kind of mythology, right? It's a kind of social mythology. Right.
So just for my clarification here, are we saying that it has actually changed over time or just been added to over time to the best of our knowledge?
I mean, it's impossible to tell, right? Because we're talking about an oral tradition. Okay. And by definition, the only manifestation of the oral tradition that you have is the most recent version of the oral tradition, right? Because there's no way to go back and check. That changes the minute that anything is written down. Then you've got documentation, right? You can look back and see if there's an earlier version or not. But up until it's written down, you can never go back and check, which actually may be the reason why it was forbidden for it to be written down in the first place, right? Because that gave it room to change and to adapt and grow, right? In ways that it wouldn't have if it were written down and codified. At any rate, there's really no way to check how the extent to which the oral tradition changes over time, except insofar as we've got anthropologists who study oral traditions, in various cultures, and can tell you that, like, yes, oral traditions change over time, while at the same time preserving remarkably intact pieces of, stories and pieces of teaching that come from a remarkably long time ago, right? Mm-hmm. Change and preservation. Rabbi? are not necessarily mutually opposing, contradictory things. What's that, B?
I was just thinking that if it's done orally, it's like, the game that people played called telephone, where one person would repeat something and then the same thing would go to the next person. And how could they really preserve the initial comments when this is what humans do? Yeah.
I mean, that's true to an extent, although in the case of oral traditions, it's very rarely exactly like a game of telephone. What makes the game of telephone so amusing is that it's one person transmitting to another person, and that person transmitting to a different person, and so on down the line, usually with a whisper, right? It's basically the worst possible condition of transmission. What we find most of the time in a real, genuine oral transmission, oral tradition, is that the tradition is transmitted not from one teacher to one student one time, but from the teacher to many students. And those students need to learn over and over and over again and practice to the teacher until they've got it to the teacher's satisfaction. And only at that point are they qualified to teach students of their own. So even under those circumstances, an oral tradition is going to change over time, but less radically than is the case in your typical game of telephone. So yeah, once again, any oral tradition is going to change over time, but maybe less so than we might imagine just thinking about it in those like highly simple terms of like a game of telephone where one child is whispering, to another and sort of giggling about it all the time. But yeah, I mean, it is certainly going to change over time. Nikki.
Yeah, just a quick thing. I think when it's transmitted to the students, when it's taught to the students, it's taught with intent, and it's not like specific words. Yeah, yes, it is specific words, but it's been discussed, its intent, and I think that's where the translation continues from generation to generation. And the fact, and I love the idea that it's a living and breathing acceptance of the oral law, that I wish more sects of Judaism would grow with it along.
Yeah. To some extent, what we're going to see in the historical development of Rabbinic Judaism is the ways in which a certain amount of flexibility ends up being sacrificed over time in order to achieve a certain amount of like codification and fixedness. And that provides huge advantages when it comes to preserving the tradition and in terms of being able to comprehend and like remember the tradition. But it also creates disadvantages when it comes to the flexibility of the tradition. And we can kind of make our own judgments about that as we go, and we'll see how that develops over time. Okay, I want to move forward from the Zugot here, right? So the Zugot period is really the period of the Second Temple, which ends in the year 70. What happens in the year 70 is that in response to yet another rebellion in the Judean provinces, the Romans come in and conquer Jerusalem and destroy the temple, the Second Temple, and essentially expel all of the Jews from Jerusalem. There aren't any Jews living in Jerusalem from that point onward for quite some time. From that period onward, right, a period roughly from the year 70 to the year 200, we call that generation the Tanaim. And this is the first period when we start seeing the title rabbi appear, being used in earnest to refer to these individuals. And this is the first several generations of what we can actually then call like the rabbinic movement, right? These are the people who inherit the Pharisaic tradition and codify it and preserve it and transmit it and transform it into something that we can now start calling Rabbinic Judaism. These early generations of rabbis who are living in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, from roughly 700 to 200 of the Common Era, we call the Tanaim. They're called the Tanaim because the word Tana means to repeat or to teach. And that's what these people were doing. They were repeating and teaching the oral tradition that they had learned from their teachers to new students, right? So as to preserve it in the face of, diaspora and exile, right? Tana also refers to a particular kind of person who had a particular kind of role in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study. A Tana was a person whose job it was to memorize as much of the oral tradition as possible and to reproduce it on demand for the students, right? So essentially imagine a person whose role is to be a living encyclopedia. And you ask that person, okay, what did Rabbi so-and-so say about this? And their job would be to give you that teaching, right? So that person was a Tana in the sense of like they repeated the tradition, right? And that's the sort of concept that gives its name to this period. This period of Tanaim, who are collecting and preserving and transmitting the oral teachings, right? Begins with the destruction of the Second Temple, and it ends in the year 200. Why does it end in the year 200? Because the year 200 is when the oral tradition, for the first time, is written down. It's written down by Rabbi Yehuda Hanazi, the Rabbi Judah the President, who is also referred to frequently in the tradition as just Rabbi, Rebbe, because he is so important. he was a person of extreme importance, both in the rabbinic community and as a secular leader of the Jewish community in exile in Palestine in that time. And it was partially because of his tremendous authority that he was able to have he felt authorized and to write down the oral Torah, which, remember, had not, previously to that, had not been written down. It was considered taboo to do so. Why does he do so? Because he sees that the Jewish community is spreading outward into many different places. And he's afraid that with Jews spreading out all over the place, the Torah is going to be lost, right? People are going to be living over here and over there and over there, and the oral Torah is going to be forgotten. And so he considers it vitally important under those circumstances to write down the tradition so it does not get lost. And so he writes down as much of the oral Torah as he can, and that text that he creates is what we call the Mishnah, which is the combined written down form of the oral Torah as it was articulated by the rabbis of the Tannaitic period. From that point forward, from the writing down of the Mishnah onward, we move into a different historical period, right? Because no longer do we have the Tannaim, right? The people who are preserving the oral tradition orally and passing it on orally. Now it's been written down. And so now we move on to a different phase. The generations after that, roughly from 200 to 500, are the people we call the Amoraim. So there's a couple features here. Number one, no longer are we just talking about Eretz Yisrael. These rabbis are living not only in Eretz Yisrael, but also in Babylonia. By this time, a large number of Jews had migrated eastward into the Babylonian Empire and were living there. And that had become and been built up into a very important Jewish community. In fact, throughout the period of the Amoraim, the Babylonian Jewish community becomes more and more central, more and more important, and the Palestinian Jewish community becomes relatively less important. That's a shift that happens throughout this period. But yeah, the Amoraim are sages in the academies of Babylonia and Israel who engage in legal study and debate about the oral tradition that was written down in the Mishnah, and also about other external rabbinic teachings that had been passed down from the Tannaim. Rabbi Judah the Prince doesn't write down all of the traditions, just a great many of them. There's a lot of other traditions in the oral Torah which are still preserved, and those are also discussed and transmitted by the Amoraim. Like the Tannaim and the Zugot before them, these scholars, the Amoraim, we generally know them by name. And they engage in a lot of debate. What we really know about the Amoraim is that they like to debate with one another about the meaning of the Mishnah, right? They'll look at the Mishnah that's written down and they'll be like, okay, whose opinion is this? And why does this person hold this, but that person holds a different opinion? And how does this person's opinion on this subject relates to their opinion about a different but related subject? They like to engage in intellectual debate and sort of compare one rule with another and kind of pick apart the laws. They're engaged in a kind of academic inquiry into the nature of Jewish law. And their debates and arguments with one another sort of grow and advance our collective understanding of the nature of the oral tradition. The only reason we know about their debates is because there's another generation after them of Babylonian sages who are from about the year 500 to 700. Generally, we call these people the Savoraim. And what's interesting about them is we don't know their names. The Zugot, we know their names. The Tannaim, we know their names. The Amoraim, we know their names. But the only reason we know their names is because the Savoraim wrote them down. By this period, the focus had shifted to collecting and arranging the teachings and the academic debates of the previous generations of Amoraim. And so the scholars of this period wrote all of these traditions down, all the arguments, all the debates, all the back and forth that was going on. And they wrote all of these things down and collated them and organized them into written documents. And the fruits of that labor is what we call the Gemara, otherwise known as the Babylonian Talmud. And so when you hear people talking about Talmud today, that's really what we're talking about. It's the sort of combined teachings of the Amoraic sages as preserved and written down and organized by the Savoraim, these sort of several generations of unnamed anonymous scholars whose whole sort of thing was like writing down these teachings and preserving them in the form of what we now know as the Babylonian Talmud. I say Babylonian, there's also a Jerusalem Talmud, or otherwise known as the Palestinian Talmud, that comes out of Eretz Yisrael. That one predates the Babylonian Talmud by about 200 years. It's somewhat less complete than the Babylonian Talmud. There's less in it. But it also contains a lot of alternate versions of a teaching or different teachings that don't appear in the Babylonian Talmud. And so it's also considered very important and interesting for Talmudic scholars to study.
I'm sorry, what is the name of that one?
It's usually called the Talmud Yerushalmi, otherwise known as the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud. A lot of contemporary scholars say that the term Palestinian Talmud is actually more accurate because the sages who were writing this did not live in Jerusalem. Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem at that time because the Romans had forbidden it. And so most of these people were living like in the Galilee or other parts of Eretz Yisrael at the time. At any rate, the period in question ends about 700 of the Common Era. And by that point, we've got what we now know as the Talmud. And so it's the end of another era with the sort of compiling of what had come before into a written document that is then preserved and transmitted forward and used as an object of study for future generations of Jews. Okay, so this ends the period that we can really think of as maybe like the formative period of Rabbinic Judaism, right? A lot of what happens later on ultimately refers back to this sort of initial flowering of Rabbinic Judaism. What happens next is the next group of sages that we're concerned with are the ones that we refer to mostly as the Geonim. This is a period, call it something like somewhere between 590 of the Common Era through about 1038 of the Common Era. So at this point, by this point, the focus has shifted all the way over to Babylon. Not much is going on of interest in Eretz Yisrael anymore when it comes to the intellectual history sort of thing. Gaon was the title of the presidents of the two great rabbinic academies of the time. By this point, there were two great rabbinic academies in Babylon. There was one in Sura and one in Pumbedita, and each of them had a president whose title was the Gaon. And during this period, the Gaonim, the heads of the academies, were sort of the highest authority when it came to Jewish law. And so one of their functions was that in addition to like heading these centers of Jewish learning, Jews from all over the world, from many different Jewish communities in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, all over the place, would send letters to the Gaonim, and the Gaon would read the letter, and it would have these questions about what is Jewish practice? What should we be doing? What's the halacha on this point? And the Gaon would write a response, a teshuvah, and send it back to that community to provide them with guidance. And so this tradition of halachic question and teshuvah, response to that question, as a way of settling and fixing and establishing this is the appropriate rabbinic Jewish practice, was sort of established at this time. And over time, with the sort of formulation of these various Gaonic teshuvot, the sort of wild and woolly debates of the Talmud, in which the rabbis are constantly arguing back and forth on various points, starts to sort of get filtered and fixed into something like a more settled body of law. That's what we're seeing at this period, is that the Jewish law starts to be more codified. It starts to be a little bit easier to establish this is actually the right practice according to Jewish law. And we're also starting to see things being codified and written down in a way that's a little bit easier to understand and comprehend, so that you don't necessarily have to, read the entire Talmud and then like filter out all of the alternate opinions and debates that lead nowhere, and like come down to some kind of actual settled law about this is how I'm supposed to actually do it. It's over time we're sort of settling into a more kind of fixed and firm understanding of this is Jewish practice. Any questions about this up to this point so far? Okay, so what happens? What's that? Okay, so what happens after that? Okay, so from about the 11th to the 15th century of the Common Era, we call the rabbis of this period the Rishonim. By this point, Jewish communities in the diaspora are much more dispersed, and the communities are growing. And independent centers of learning start to grow up in various places outside of Babylon. And so over time, there's no longer so much of a need to rely on the Babylonian academies, right? People don't have to write to the Gaon of the yeshiva in Pumbedita anymore. They can ask their own rabbis who are nearer at hand, right? If you're in Germany, you can ask the German rabbis what's going on. If you're in Spain, you can ask the Spanish rabbis what's going on, right? And that's a lot easier than having to send a letter all the way to Babylon. And consequently, as a result, the Babylonian academies are fading in importance. They're becoming less important. And there's also a tendency, because of this, for there to be some amount of halachic divergence between far-flung Jewish communities. So that thing that Rabbi Judah the Prince was a little worried about, that like Jews might start practicing differently in different places because of the diaspora, that's starting to actually become a thing by this point in the Middle Ages. Because now there's rabbis in Europe, and there's rabbis in Spain, and rabbis in Africa and the Middle East, right? And those rabbis are providing halakhic responses to their own communities. And so over time, subtle differences start to creep in terms of the practice between, for example, the Sephardic Jewish community, who originate in Spain, but then sort of disperse into the Middle East and Asia and Northern Africa, versus the Ashkenazi Jewish community, right, who are centered in Europe. You start to get differences in Jewish practice. The prayers are getting subtly different between one group and another. Some of the customs are a little bit different from one community to another. And you start to see a divergence in terms of Jewish practice between these different communities. At the same time, nevertheless, contact continues between these different communities, fostered by migration and trade. And so there's always a connection and a communication between the different communities. But each larger community sort of has its own kind of center of gravity and tends to do things a little bit its own way. What's also important about this period of the Rishonim is that the halakha starts to get codified a lot more. And by this point, we're starting to see the production of legal codes that attempt to set down the halakha in a systematic way, right? So if I want to know, right, what are the laws regarding teshuvah, or what are the laws regarding Shabbat, I can pick up a manual of halakha and look at it under those subject headings and see all of the halakha without having to wade through the Talmud. there are a number of important Jewish codes that are produced throughout this period. One of the most comprehensive early codes is the Mishnah Torah that's produced by Maimonides. But there's a number of other important codes that are produced throughout the Middle Ages as well. But the really important code for the purposes of like later Jewish development gets developed pretty much at the end of this period. And in fact, the end of the period we're talking about, the period of the Rishonim, can pretty much be defined when Rabbi Yosef Karo writes the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is considered widely to be the most comprehensive and authoritative halakhic code of its time, and essentially gets adopted as more or less authoritative by the entire Jewish world moving forward from that point. And so what defines the end of the period of the Rishonim is the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, more or less. And the period after the writing of the Shulchan Aruch is the period of the Acharonim. Rishonim means former ones, first ones. Acharonim means the later ones, the after ones. The before and after there is before the Shulchan Aruch and after the Shulchan Aruch. So the Acharonim are roughly from the 1500s on up to the present day. And they're defined, this period is defined by really a couple of things. One, by the general recognition of the Shulchan Aruch as a more or less authoritative presentation of the halakhic system up to that point. And also by, like later on in the period, by the development of modern Jewish denominations, some of which, like Reform, don't operate according to traditional halakha at all, right? We start to see the development of that much, later on into the, the early 1700s and into the 1800s. And so we start to get the birth of modern denominationalism, right? We're still technically living in the period of the Acharonim, right? That we haven't, mostly we haven't really established any new term that, divides us from the Acharonim. Okay, so why is this important? The main reason that I want to sort of walk through this is that as we kind of go forward and look at different rabbis, it's going to become important to understand where these rabbis are situated in the broad development of rabbinic thinking. Because some of them are going to be from very, very early on, right? And they're going to be operating within a framework where Jewish law is not nearly as settled or fixed or established as it is in later periods. Each generation, each era of Jewish thinking builds on what came before it. Even if, one generation is reacting against something, the previous generation's version of Judaism, that still is kind of building, right? We're still moving forward from something, right? Even a rebel is rebelling against something. And so I think it's important to understand sort of the broad sweep of this is sort of how Jewish thinking develops. In particular, the way it develops in terms of moving from a more flexible oral tradition into a more written tradition, right? Which is really necessitated by the dispersal of the Jewish people. Because an oral tradition works really well if you've got a small, tight-knit community who all live within a day's walk of each other. Because then you can sort of transmit that tradition easily, and everybody stays on the same page, even as the tradition changes over time. But if you are living far, far away from one another, it's impossible to maintain any kind of close community that's purely oral, that's purely relying on an oral tradition. At that point, you need some sort of written communication, some kind of written documentation, something that isn't as flexible as the oral tradition, because that's what is needed in order to be able to sort of preserve and transmit a tradition that's going to extend not from one village to another, but from one continent to another. And so over time, we see the development of Jewish law from a relatively flexible system in which things tend to sort of change and shift a little bit, in which there are different valid opinions, into a system that is a little bit more rigid, where some things become settled law, more or less, and later generations look at those things as more or less settled and established and regard them as authoritative, and so on and so forth, moving forward through the generations, up until the modern period, when there's something of reaction against that, at least within certain Jewish circles, and you start to see, non-halachic or differently halachic forms of Judaism begin to arise, and that's where you get the birth of modern denominationalism. All right, it's 8:29 now. I want to still save a little bit of room here for like people to ask some questions or kind of reflect. This has been a lot of stuff here. So we don't have to finish up just yet, but I do want to be wary of time as well. So I'm done with my spiel at this point. So I want to just leave room for anyone to ask questions or address any points that were a little unclear or whatever.
Rabbi, I just wanted to ask you about the Shulchan Aruch, as far as being the authoritative for halakha. Is it, and you said it was widely accepted. My understanding is that it's basically accepted amongst the Ashkenaz community. I'm not too sure how accepted it is amongst the Sephardic community, because I think that they do have their own. There were codexes that you read about that have been found from the Sephardic community. So that's my question: the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardi as far as halakhic authority.
So actually, Yosef Karo is a Sephardic rabbi, and the Shulchan Aruch fundamentally reflects Sephardic halakha. A little bit later, not too long after he had published the Shulchan Aruch, an Ashkenazi rabbi, I can't remember his name now right offhand, but I'll look it up for you at some point, writes an addendum to the Shulchan Aruch called Aruch HaShulchan. Shulchan Aruch means the set table, like a table that's been set for, for dinner. Aruch HaShulchan means the table is set. Or the table setting. So the Aruch HaShulchan essentially is like, all it does is it's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch that points out places where the Ashkenazi halacha differs from the Sephardi halacha. So the modern Shulchan Aruch that you purchase, when it's published, contains the Aruch HaShulchan as part of its like interlinear, like textual, like insertions. And so it's authoritative for both. You just have to pay attention to, like, if you're Sephardi, you go with the basic text, and if you're Ashkenazi, if you go according to Ashkenazi halacha, you have to pay attention to those additional kind of inserts that point out.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Who was that wrote?
Aruch HaShulchan. Let me look it up real quick for folks.
I can check later.
No, I got it. Just a second. Yeah, the glosses on the glosses on differences in Ashkenazi halacha, I believe, come from the Rima, from Moses Isserlis. It's also some kind, his drash on it is also sometimes called the mappa, which literally means the tablecloth. in any event, when you get the Shulchan Aruch these days, or like really at any time prior to like the first, decade or so after the Shulchan Aruch's publication, it's got both in it. So, it's considered authoritative both for Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. Although there are some Middle Eastern Jewish communities that that have their own particular approaches that don't rely on the Shulchan Aruch at all. There's I believe the Syrian Jewish community for a long time, I don't know if they still do, but they used to pretty much rely on the Maimonides' Mishnah Torah as their authoritative code. But yeah, I mean, by and large, the vast majority of the Orthodox world today relies on the Shulchan Aruch primarily. Other questions? Mickey.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that this was a fabulous presentation. I took copious notes because that's my learning style. It really put it into, perspective when you hear these words like Shulchan Aruch, and you hear, these words in the Talmud. And so I got a sense of where they were historically and who was involved in them. And that has been enormously helpful. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. Yeah, I hope that future meetings of this class, I hope, will be a little bit less dry and a little bit less kind of lecture-y. But yeah, I'm hoping that this will provide us with enough historical context to be kind of getting on with when it comes to looking at individual rabbis from various periods throughout these, periods of history that we were looking at tonight.
Yeah, because now we can figure out where they fit into the scheme of things, now that we know how it progresses.
Yeah, I recommend hanging on to that graphic that I sent of the rabbinic timeline. It's going to come really in handy. It's going to come in handy when we start looking at these different rabbis to figure out like where they fit in on that timeline, and that's going to become important in terms of understanding what their historical context is.
I'm really fascinated by this period of time where there was all these letters exchanged. I don't know. It's just so cool to think about.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It just really intrigued me.
No, and that period is really very formative when it comes to the establishment of halakha as like fixed law. Because prior to that, you could read the Talmud your entire life. And if you're not willing to sort of come down and make your own decisions on a couple of key points, it's not super easy to determine what the actual halacha is from the Talmud. And the reason for that is just the Talmud doesn't exist to provide you with a code of this is what you're supposed to do. The Talmud is a record of a bunch of academics having debates about stuff.
Which is, maybe you get option paralysis.
Well, right, because what the Amoraim are more interested in is having an interesting argument and exploring different ideas. They're not really that interested in establishing settled law. And so when you read the Talmud, frequently you'll have huge, long arguments and debates that extend on sometimes for pages without ever actually determining what the actual answer is. Or you end up with a simple statement that like teku, there was no ultimate decision on this point, and we'll have to wait for the rabbi, for Elijah to come and tell us. Right? Because for them, settling the law wasn't nearly as interesting or important as it was having a debate about it, right?
What it means, yeah.
But for Jews living in various communities, right, throughout the diaspora, what they needed to know was, okay, so what actually is kosher, and like how do I actually celebrate Passover, right? And for those purposes, the Gaonim became very important, right? They were the sort of Miss Manners or Emily Post of their day, that the various Jewish communities would send them letters and they would write back and say, this is how the halakha is. And that's pretty much how halakha gets built up until the point where we start to see codes that are written down that sort of assemble all of that into a sort of format that people can more easily access and read.
Rabbi, just in response to what Ross just said about the letters going back and forth. If anybody interested to read anything about the Cairo Geniza and the finds there and the letters that went back and forth, and dealing from everything to marriage contracts and business receipts to I believe they actually did find letters by Maimonides. There, I remember one book is called Sacred Trash. That was very good. But then there are a couple of others, about Solomon Schechter and, the whole discoveries in the Geniza. It's very, very fascinating reading.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really important historical, like archaeological find, precisely because a lot of the material that was found therein dates back to this like key and important period that was so formative for, Judaism as it came to be practiced throughout the Jewish world, like, subsequently.
You both use the word Geniza. What is that?
All right. So a Geniza is a room that is sort of a kind of attic whose job it is to hold a bunch of texts. So because we place such an important role on God's name in Judaism, we don't throw away or destroy anything that's got God's name written on it. And so one approach to how to deal with that is anything that's got God's name written on it, you take and you put in a room and just like leave it there.
After you don't need it anymore.
After books wear out, right? So, people would take that and put it in a room, right? And that's a Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is a Geniza that they found in Cairo in Egypt that contains a whole bunch of documentation from that Jewish community that stretched back for like to very, very early a period. There was material there that basically like stretched back into the Gaonic period, and contains a lot of interesting just material, right? Not only on the subject, the subject of, Judaism, but also just business documents and things like that. It was a real treasure trove of material on the Jewish community from that period of time. Most synagogues have something like a Geniza, right? For books that get worn out, things like that. There are also ways of disposing of material from a Geniza that you can bury it if you do it in a particular way that's like considered respectful, right? So yeah, in this particular case, it had just been a collection of stuff that had been kind of walled off and had just been sitting there and had remained relatively intact because Egypt has a very dry climate and had been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years until it was rediscovered. All right, any more questions?
Yeshikov, Rabbi, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have any more questions.
Great-
That was
great
excellent.
class. Thank you.
It's just
Thank you.
fascinating, Rabbi. I
Great.
learned so much new.
So I'm going to save this recording and probably put it up on YouTube or something like that, make it available for people to access if they want to go back over and look at it, or if you know somebody who wants to take part in these classes who didn't get a chance to come today, you can share the link with them. And then, like I said, as we move forward, the format from now on for this class is going to be each time we'll select one rabbi, and I will talk about who that rabbi was and a little bit about what we know about their life, and also about whatever makes them important or significant in the history of Jewish thought. And we'll kind of talk about them and look at a little bit of stuff, from them. In general terms, at least to begin with, I think I'm going to sort of vaguely move in a historical way. So we'll probably start with some of the, Zugot and kind of move forward. But I don't want to really hold myself to that in any kind of, clear-cut way. We may kind of double back and, we'll see. I think the important thing is to have access to the timeline, and that way we can kind of dip our toes into rabbis from a variety of different periods and still be oriented and know where we are. So I think we'll finish it up here for the night. Thanks everyone for being here with us for this, and I hope we can continue on with this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks
That
very
was
much.
very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.